truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Monday, April 29th, 2024, the 1195th day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening to the podcast on the day of its release. The only way to do that is by becoming a paid subscriber at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can do so for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month, and in doing so, you will be supporting me, the work I do, and this show as it expands. And if you can't or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the podcast for free a couple days later on a wide variety of podcast platforms and, of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. So, okay, this week on Wednesday, that would be May 1st, this Wednesday, I will be doing another live stream for paid subscribers on Substack. The way that's going to work is I will create a post on Substack that you will see. It'll be called something like Very Reasonable Live Stream number 2 and probably have the date 05/01/24. And in that post, I will have a link that will direct you to the unlisted live stream on Rumble. I will probably send that out at some point Tuesday afternoon, Tuesday evening, maybe Wednesday morning. All that should matter is that it is out before the live stream. The live stream will take place at 3 p.m. Eastern. So at some point before then, you will have a link that arrives in your email box if you receive email notifications from Substack. And if not, head on over to Substack, find that post, and that post will contain that link. I'm going to try to operate this thing this way, and if it doesn't work, then we will change course, but this should work. I am also considering maybe doing one mid-afternoon like this and another in the early evening and kind of rotating back and forth each week so that 1 week it'll be mid-afternoon, 1 week it'll be early evening, and then right back to mid-afternoon, we'll just go back and forth. Hopefully that will make it so that everybody can participate at least sometimes. If you have feedback on that and want to let me know your thoughts, obviously you are more than welcome to submit them in the comment section of this post. And one other thing before we get into the main section of the podcast today, I was doing quite a bit of digging online over the weekend, pursuing some specific topics that I wanted to know more about and get more clarity on. And of course, whatever I look into is always offensive to somebody and censored at some level and in some places by whatever system is controlling these things. And I believe that for the most part, I'm pretty decent at figuring out how to get around a lot of that stuff and use these systems effectively and productively. But we all get into habits, and over time, you don't think, oh, wait, maybe they're still changing this system and I need to adapt again. And if you don't ever think about doing that, you wind up finding yourself stuck in the intellectual kids table problem that I have described before, because censorship doesn't only affect our ability to say the things that we want to say, it also affects the ability of people to see the things that we want to say. And that problem works the opposite direction as well. If certain contributors and certain topics are being censored, they will not come to our attention. There will be entire aspects of various subjects that we'll have no idea about just because it never even intersects with our awareness. And so if we're missing out on big chunks of information that might have a critical effect on our understanding of an issue, we can be left ignorant about important subjects based on the manipulations of a system that we don't control. So it's always good to review how we are trying to get information in the first place. That's one of the reasons why I don't spend time on Twitter anymore. Twitter promotes certain subjects, certain information, certain sources of information, while demoting others. And while this is occurring, people on the Uniparty left demand more censorship, while the people on the Uniparty right are celebrating how Twitter is a free speech platform. And the effect is that we don't know what we don't know. We end up having a conversation about the details of a complete and total fiction, not even realizing we're doing it. And of course, those people who have never been censored, who've spent the last 4 years around the intellectual kids table, they're the ones being promoted and dominating the conversations so that people end up identifying with points that exist within that informational bubble, most often just falling into one side or the other of a controlled opposition dynamic. And when you're caught in that situation, you're going to miss really important factors in whatever you're thinking about without even realizing it. It's very hard to break out of the central narrative when all the information you have access to supports the reality of the central narrative. The intellectual kids table problem is one of the biggest problems in the information environment right now, which is why we should always be conscious of it. Now, as I've mentioned before, one of the easiest things we can do to make sure that we are not being victimized too much by that problem is to go to the search engine, look at the settings on the search engine. Now, you shouldn't be using Google or Bing or DuckDuckGo. Those are search engines for children. You're not going to find what you're looking for there. But even many of the alternatives have different versions of the same problem. And again, you can't even know that the problem exists unless you have something else to compare it to. So for years, I've been using Quant. I realized that Google and Bing and DuckDuckGo weren't good, so I switched over to Quant. Quant was better. And there are some other comparable browsers, but even those browsers, their default setting will be to apply some sort of safe search feature, which helps make sure that you don't get any information from the dangerous parts of the internet. So you can go into the settings for your browser and turn off the safe search. And that is generally very helpful. But again, you can't know what you're missing unless you have something else to compare it to. Now, there are a lot of conflicts happening throughout the world right now that cannot be understood without looking at history and geography and seeing how people moved around the world and which countries had conflicts with which other countries, how those conflicts were resolved, etc., etc. And you cannot get down to the root of these conflicts that pit nation versus nation, people versus people, without exploring subjects that we all know are generally off limits for mainstream conversation. They are the sorts of things that get censored out of conversations completely. There are just subjects we're not allowed to discuss, and it turns out that those subjects are probably the most important subjects in the world, which is why they don't want us discussing them. And so if you are researching those subjects, doing it through search engines you know are or could be censored isn't going to get you where you need to go. And so over the past few years, when I am actually doing serious research, I will move to different browsers, namely Jibiru.com, Gibiru, or sometimes FreeSpoke. But I have generally found Jibiru to be the best one. Now, this week, someone told me to go and try Yandex, which is, I guess, a Russian search engine. And so I get all the Russian disinformation. But it's actually not all Russian disinformation. And I'm not exactly sure why Russian disinformation is more dangerous than American disinformation or British disinformation or disinformation coming out of Israel. And as far as the global regime is concerned, those are the three main places from whence disinformation flows. All of it is just information among other information, so we actually need to apply our discernment at all times rather than thinking some sources are good and some sources are bad. If we start with that assumption, then we have already done the work of the censors for them. They don't even need to worry about us. If we are still in that mindset where we think there are good sources and bad sources, it is all just information among other information. We should try to understand the biases and try to discern how those biases might affect the information we're taking in, but it's all just information among other information. But we are in the midst of a very strange year. We know that there are strategies being pursued that will lead to the censorship of us as individuals, topics that we might discuss, platforms that we might use, and certainly search engines where we may be able to find new information. And the strength of that censorship will very likely increase over time. And we need to be conscious of that so that the intellectual kids' table problem does not affect us when we are trying to figure out what the hell is going on amidst all of the chaos and disinformation out there coming in from all directions. Now, most of what you probably do online doesn't require a censorship-free search engine because you're very likely searching for things that would not be censored. But when you are doing information, when you are trying to get to the bottom of some issue that you don't understand, some geopolitical issue, for instance, or anything to do with health, or any other controversial topic, you're going to want to know that you are getting access to the most possible information so that you can take in information from all viewpoints and see what actually maps onto reality. You've got to be discerning all the time. Just because you're getting a view that counters the mainstream view does not mean you're getting true information. So it's still just as important to vet and be discerning as it is when you're reading some fake news article from CNN. But next time you're trying to research a topic, open up a Jabiru search, open up a Yandex search, and then use your normal browser, type the same search into all three, and see what results you get. And if the search engine you're using turns up results that are only from inside that informational bubble, whereas the other search engines are giving you more options, you should understand that your incoming information flow is being censored and that you will be subject to the intellectual kids table problem if that is as far as you go. Now, a lot of people would have the knee-jerk response to say, well, okay, but the algorithm that is providing these search results in these older legacy search platforms, that algorithm is selecting for relevance. Well, okay, what does relevance mean? Is it popularity? If it's popularity, those links might be popular because they're the only ones that turn up on the search engines most people use. So the algorithm then hasn't really selected for relevance. It has selected for popularity among average mainstream internet users. The thing about algorithms is they are not designed to give you what you want. They are designed to give you what will best keep your attention among the things the machine has determined are acceptable for your consumption. But anyhow, just a word to the wise. I was a bit taken aback over the weekend, realizing just how much the results I was getting on Quant were being tailored in ways that were not helpful at all. I posted about this over the weekend, and a lot of people brought up a search engine called Tusk. That is essentially a Uniparty right search engine brought to us by Matt Schlapp, his wife, and some others. Matt Schlapp being the man behind CPAC. It is basically as normie Uniparty right a search engine as you could possibly ever find. When you go to the search engine, the entire page is advertisements for mainstream Uniparty right platforms. Fox News, The Daily Wire, The Blaze, Babylon Bee, The Hill, the new alternative mainstream media podcasters who have migrated over to Rumble, Russell Brand, Tucker Carlson, that whole thing. Now, as a segue to take us from that back into some show topics and to lead into what I want to talk about today, this morning I was listening to a talk that Steve Bannon gave in 2018 at the Oxford Union. He gave remarks for about 20 minutes on Donald Trump and on populism and how populism was spreading around the world, some of the work he had been doing with various leaders in Europe And then he began taking questions from a lot of people that don't like him very much because, of course, they have no idea what he stands for and what he's even saying. But at one point, he had to answer to claims of fascism. And in his answer, he said something very interesting about a subject we've been discussing pretty regularly over the last couple of years and even a few times last week, which is that information environment on social media and how that will be changing in the future, understanding all of the abuses and all of the manipulation coming from those legacy social media platforms that are inextricably linked to regime governments and the forces controlling those governments. Have a listen.
The other thing is, remember, fascism is worshiping the state. State capitalism combined with big government is fascism. It's what Mussolini had. It's what Hitler had. It's what China has today. It is the scariest system in the world because you take all the worst elements of capitalism and you combine it with the worst elements of authoritarian government, and you've got problems. That is why the third leg, I said it at CPAC, the third leg of the Trump stool is the deconstruction of the administrative state. I'm a nationalist, but I don't worship the nation. I'm a nationalist because I think that is the unit since the Treaty of Westphalia that served us best, and that citizens have the most control and the most ability to control. So yes, I'm a populist because I believe in the little guy and I'm anti-elite. I'm a nationalist because I believe in the nation state. But fascism is the worship of the state, and you want more consolidation of power. I want deconstruction. I'm the guy who keeps saying Facebook should be broken up. Google should be broken up. We should take the data and drop it down to a public trust. I've said that for over a year. So my point is, the mainstream media wants to position the same way, and the reason is that the elite and the corporatist elite do not want change, and they have to defeat populism and nationalism by smearing it with racism, nativism, and xenophobia. But it won't work, because the more that the programs are successful, we march forward.
Okay, so I let the clip go on a little bit so that we could get Bannon's full thought there. But the part I want to focus on is what he said about breaking up Facebook and Google and dropping all of that data into a public trust. Now, I can't know exactly what he means there, but I think I have a pretty good idea. We know that Facebook and Google basically collect all the data we produce all the time. If you are signing into apps or websites with Facebook, your Facebook ID, or your Google ID, Facebook and Google are grabbing all of the information you produce on those apps or in your interactions with that website. And if the app accesses your contacts, well, then Facebook has your contacts. If the app accesses your location data, then Facebook has your location data. I think any listener to this podcast probably has a pretty good understanding of how much of our data goes into these systems. It's all of it. And over the years, I've talked about one centralized data repository for all of this data. I often refer to it as the great cloud in the sky, the place where all of your data goes to live, so that the governing bodies and organizations and people who have access to that data can put it through their algorithms and analyze it in any way they need to make sure that we are doing exactly what we need to do. Well, at some point, there must be a determination made about what to do with that data. I can't imagine anybody wants all of their data to remain in the hands of corporate oligarchs and intelligence agencies and major corporations and these tech companies. But they have it all now, or at least they have it up to a certain point. And I feel like maybe at some point in the last few years, they've been cut off from it. But what happens to that data? Does it go away? Does it all get deleted? Has it already been deleted? We can't possibly know that right now. But what happens in the future? And if it doesn't get deleted, then who takes it and what happens with it? Now, there are certainly people who have lived better, more honorable, more morally pure lives than I have. But unless you've really been on the straight and narrow throughout this information age, then there is probably something in each and every one of our data history, our web search history, our text message history, our location history that could compromise us either at work or with our relationships, our spouses, there's a very strong likelihood that at some point we've created data that if it came out to the public, it could be used to influence or harm us. And that's part of how the corruption and compromise system has worked as it's been wielded by the regime over hundreds of years or thousands of years. Consider how valuable compromising information is. No one wants their lives ruined by something that they did before. And if you're playing reputation games, trying to succeed within the party of false decorum, everyone understands that their reputation is essentially always at risk all the time if the wrong information gets into the hands of the wrong people and those wrong people choose to use the information against us. So what's the solution? Is the solution that everyone has access to everything, thereby creating a situation of mutually assured destruction? That is a plausible scenario, and it's one that we might encounter in the future. And maybe that is the best solution. Maybe that creates a situation where each of us has to come to terms and own our pasts and make peace with our past. Maybe it encourages us to seek God's forgiveness. And when we are forgiven by God, then it doesn't matter how someone might judge us for what we have done before. Maybe it encourages us to be less judgmental of other people, understanding that we all share in the same human frailty. Maybe we have to be forgiving because we require the same forgiveness in return. Maybe we lose the illusion that all of these things that we have done that are online and have been recorded and do exist somewhere are not actually private and never were. And we understand, well, you know what? If everything I'm doing in my life can potentially be known by others, well, then I need to live in a different way so that I don't have to worry about being ashamed if someone finds out something I've done. Or maybe there's a scenario where all that data can be moved to one place and a determination can be made by each and every individual as to what will become of their personal data that has already been collected. I'm not sure what the answer is, but I think that we are probably going to end up in a situation something like this in the future, and we're going to have to think about what that means for us and how we want to treat these sorts of things. And then, of course, if you really want to get into it, you can add the extra layer, which is the possibility and the likelihood that our real data will probably be mixed in with a whole lot of fake data as well. Now, I don't know if that's what Steve Bannon was talking about, but I suspect that it is along those lines. These companies have collected the most intimate details of our lives. If we have consistently been on social media over the last 15 years, and many, if not virtually all of us have been, then we've created an extraordinary amount of data, and something's got to be done with it. I tend to think that how this problem will be resolved in the future is going to be a major issue and probably major business for whoever becomes good at solving it. But let's switch gears. So over the years, we have talked quite a bit about a concept referred to as Kayfabe. That is a word that comes from the World Wrestling Federation, that is now the WWE, World Wrestling Entertainment. They gave their WWF away to the World Wildlife Fund. Now, most people understand going in that professional wrestling is staged. It is not a real competition. It is two wrestlers who may well be great wrestlers, great athletes, whatever, but they are not there for a wrestling competition. They are there to simulate a wrestling competition for the entertainment of those watching. But the WWE is not just about the wrestling. It's about the fan experience. It's about the rivalries created between one wrestler and another. But just like the wrestling competition is scripted and staged, the rivalry itself is also scripted and staged. They'll interview one wrestler and he'll talk about how the other wrestler is one of the worst people in the world and the things that he would do to this other man when he gets his hands on him. Oh, he's going to say something about his mom or his wife, and everybody's going to be very angry. And then the other wrestler is going to yell and grunt and scream about what he's going to do to that other man. And it's all kind of gay, but you get the picture. It is the set of actions that allows for the suspension of disbelief. It's what helps make the whole thing seem real. You actually want one of the wrestlers to conquer the other wrestler. And it upsets you when a wrestler says something mean about your favorite wrestler, even though it's all scripted and staged. The actions are not sincere. These are not real, authentic people expressing their real, authentic feelings. They are performing to create a desired effect. And over the past few years, we've been applying this concept fairly regularly to what we see in politics. Because politics in 2024 is a reality show, a soap opera playing out on television. And some of it may be for entertainment. It has to be at least somewhat entertaining in order to keep our attention. But it's about more than just entertainment and attention, because at the end of the TV show, we are supposed to empower one side or another with our voice or our vote, our support in some way. Even if that support is just passive, as long as we allow them to continue playing out the stage play while they implement their agenda in our government, thus controlling our lives, that's good. They're actually even fine if you don't find the thing entertaining at all, or even if you find it offensive and you turn it all off completely. Now, we have discussed over the past few years whether or not kayfabe is an aspect of what we are seeing with Donald Trump in order to provide some cover for whatever is happening behind the scenes. And there are certain characters in this ongoing drama that have been suggested as parts of anti-Trump kayfabe. First and foremost would be Vice President Mike Pence. And then you can look at people like Mike Pompeo and Bill Barr, people who seemed like good guys during Trump's first term who have since turned their backs on him, or at least consistently give the impression of that in public. Mike Pence famously, obviously, did not send the electors back to the states and extend the time before approving and certifying the electors on January 6th. A lot of people find that totally unforgivable. And I'm not here to argue you out of that, because I believe that there's at least a possibility that that's correct. It's also possible that Mike Pence did exactly what he was asked to. Bill Barr famously, obviously, said that he did not believe he had seen adequate evidence indicating widespread fraud that would have changed the outcome of the election. He said it very publicly, and his comments are one of the very few justifications that Biden supporters have when they are making the case that Joe Biden is somehow a legitimate president. They say, even Donald Trump's attorney general said that there wasn't widespread fraud, as if some public official appointed by Donald Trump going on to somehow betray Trump is outside the realm of possibility. It is obviously not. People who thought Bill Barr was a terrible man immediately revised their thinking and decided that Bill Barr was one of the most honest men who had ever lived, because he supported their position that there was not election fraud. Mike Pence, by the way, went on and participated, at least early on, in the fake Republican primary process, again indicating publicly that there was a major rift between Pence and Donald Trump. Trump really was the bad guy, as he was described in the media. Or even if he wasn't the bad guy they made him out to be, he at least made some poor decisions at some very important moments. And Mike Pence, being the very buttoned-up conservative he is, just could not in good conscience get behind supporting Donald Trump. Mike Pompeo has made a very similar case over the years, publicly accepting the results of the stolen election in 2020 and even considering a potential presidential run of his own. And then, of course, we discussed this at length throughout the Ron DeeSantis op. Was Ron a kayfabe actor working as the face of a pro-Trump red team op? He was going to be anti-Trump, the guy that all the rhinos hoped he could be, someone who was like Trump but not Trump. Someone who could replace Trump and appeal to America First voters while ultimately supporting the priorities of the Uniparty right. Ron was going to simply act as that guy, and through doing that, he would draw out all the Uniparty right donors who really just supported the regime. They ostensibly supported Republican causes and Republican candidates, but most of that was just branding and marketing to cover over what their real priorities were, as their real priorities were totally aligned with the Uniparty agenda on behalf of the global regime. And of course, the same holds true for Republican think tanks, for lobbyists, for Con Inc. media and the influencer class. And whether or not the Ron op was kayfabe, the process was very effective for drawing out all of those people. So let's take a look at a couple of cases that emerged over the weekend. First, comments from Bill Barr, who seems to, at this point, be proof of this theory as operative throughout the last few years. And then some developments in the Ron situation, which may suggest kayfabe as well. Here's Bill Barr.
Response to you saying you'd vote for the Republican ticket. Wow, former AG Bill Barr, who let a lot of great people down by not investigating voter fraud in our country, has just endorsed me for president, despite the fact that I called him weak, slow-moving, lethargic, gutless, and lazy. Based on the fact that I greatly appreciate his wholehearted endorsement, I am removing the word lethargic from my statement. Thank you, Bill.
Yeah. It's classic Trump. What's the question?
What's your response?
Well, I mean, obviously, what I said was that I'm very disappointed that this country is stuck with this choice between two people who I don't think either of them should be president of the United States. But given that binary choice, I feel I have to choose Trump.
But he's mocking you.
So it's not about me. I think that I've said this all along. If faced with a choice between two people, neither of which I think should be president, I feel it's my duty to pick the person who I think would do the least damage to the country. And I think Trump would do less damage than Biden. And I think all this stuff about a threat to democracy, I think the real threat to democracy is the progressive movement and the Biden administration.
The Biden administration or President Biden himself?
Biden's support for the progressive agenda.
I think a lot of people hear that, and the case that we just talked about that went before the Supreme Court essentially, and say, how can you see that and say that Biden is a greater threat to democracy?
Well, where are we losing our freedoms? How are our freedoms being constrained? They're being constrained by the progressive government. And, democracy, especially, from the Anglosphere democracies, the Five Eyes and so forth, the threat's never been for autocratic government on the right.
But how specifically is Biden threatening democracy?
The threat to freedom and democracy has always been on the left. It's the collectivist, socialist agenda. And that is where we're losing our freedom.
Now, even within that clip, it's hard to tell where Bill Barr really authentically stands when it comes to Donald Trump. Now, they've said a bunch of nasty things about each other over the past few years. And the question is, are they doing it for show? Is it better that people who support Joe Biden's legitimacy, whether they're on the Uniparty left or the Uniparty right, believe that Bill Barr is a straight shooter and not some kind of Trump lackey while the last 3.5 years have played out? If we are right about something else going on behind the scenes, and of course there's always something else going on behind the scenes, but if that includes Trump having a full and complete understanding and mountains of irrefutable evidence, as he surely has, when it comes to election theft and any number of other crimes against America and crimes against humanity, then can all of this progress as it has to if everyone who was around Trump at that point is out there calling Joe Biden an illegitimate president? Now, I would argue, personally speaking, for my personal preference, that would have been the way to approach things. But again, I'm open to the idea that a psyop was required to break our lifetime of being psyoped. And if I'm honest, it was entirely possible that I was psyoped out of the psyop I had been conditioned into. So for the purposes of that effort, is it possible and was it necessary for various characters to publicly represent a set of beliefs and ideas that are not real and authentic to them in order to achieve the desired effect. And once you answer that, then a moral conversation begins about whether or not that's an acceptable thing to do. Now, Trump's Truth Social post about Bill Barr is hilarious. He includes 5 insults and then says he's taking one of them back because Bill Barr has chosen to endorse Donald Trump as opposed to Joe Biden in this fake 2024 election. Caitlin Collins reads the whole post, expects Bill Barr to be insulted and talk about how Donald Trump is so immature and he shouldn't be tweeting things like this and it's not presidential. We've heard the script run so many times now. But Bill Barr laughs and says, classic Trump. Does he sound mad at Trump? Does he sound insulted? No, he sounds like a guy who understands that he and his buddy are joking around with each other, and the joke is actually on anyone who's taking it all seriously. And then because he can't give the whole game away, he turns around and says, well, I don't think either of them should be running. And that's a good point because in some important sense, neither of them are, but we can ignore that for now. He says he wishes neither of them were running, but then spends the rest of the conversation talking about the legitimate dangers of continuing along the path of implementing this Uniparty agenda on behalf of the global regime, this collectivist ideology. So Bill Barr, Trump's attorney general, who became anti-Trump and was honest, quote unquote, the entire time about the 2020 election, now he is making the case against the Uniparty's agenda, and it's damning. He's saying to people who have come to trust him in CNN's audience that no matter what it is you think Trump has done, and no matter what I, Bill Barr, have agreed that Trump has done, he is still a better choice than this absolute abomination of a quote-unquote presidency being conducted by Joe Biden. Caitlin Collins is basically dumbfounded, but something has always seemed a little off about that guy. And it's very likely that CNN's viewers are confused as well. How are they supposed to feel about that? How are they supposed to feel about Bill Barr saying, yeah, all right, Trump's bad and he insults me a lot, but he's not Joe Biden bad? CNN just released a poll yesterday that shows Donald Trump up 6 points over Joe Biden, 49-43. And yes, polls are fake, and Donald Trump's support is far stronger than that. But think about this from the perspective of someone in CNN's audience. You find out Donald Trump is dominating Joe Biden in national popularity. That's not the Electoral College screwing the communists out of their democracy. And it's not a product of Russian collusion. It's just that most people prefer Donald Trump and Donald Trump as president to anything Joe Biden. So you get that news, and then you get Bill Barr, who represents one of your only justifications for why Joe Biden could even possibly be a legitimate president. And think about how that exists in the minds of some of these people. That's the purpose of the kayfabe, if it is indeed kayfabe. Now, again, we should leave open the possibility that it isn't. There are plausible explanations for why it wouldn't be. And regardless, it would be irresponsible to only consider that we have nailed something that is extremely complicated, very complex, and well obscured, if not totally opaque to us, that is happening behind the scenes. We cannot be certain about that stuff. So we have to keep in mind that there are always other possibilities out there. But considering how fake we know most of politics is, it's a near certainty that what we describe as kayfabe is active in various situations every day. We had a primetime TV show to convince us that January 6th was an insurrection, under the guise of it being a legitimate congressional investigation and committee. So it's not like this isn't a technique that gets used. Should we really suspect that our side wouldn't be using it too? And again, you end up right back at the same moral conversation. So let's talk about Ron DeSantis. This is Fox News yesterday. Trump DeSantis meet privately for several hours in Miami. Former President Trump and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis met privately in Miami on Sunday. Multiple Republicans with knowledge of the meeting confirmed to Fox News. Okay, so anonymous Republicans. All we know is that there was more than one person and that all of the people were described as Republicans. We don't know who these people are. Are they on the Trump team? Are they on the Ron team? Are they people who all heard the same rumor that was seeded specifically as disinformation to get people to come to Fox News and say, hey, Ron and Trump met. We got to tell everybody. We don't know, and we have no way of knowing. And maybe we will in the future, but we don't right now. During the several-hour meeting, DeSantis agreed to help Trump as the GOP's presumptive presidential nominee tries to close his fundraising gap with President Biden in their 2024 election rematch, the sources confirmed. Okay, so Donald Trump needs help with fundraising. That is what we are supposed to believe. Except Donald Trump doesn't need help with fundraising. Donald Trump's court cases are the best campaign that could ever be run. The American public is seeing that Donald Trump is the target of political prosecution and persecution, as are his supporters. They are also the targets of censorship. They have been called domestic terrorists. They have been pursued and prosecuted for taking part in a very violent insurrection that never happened. The American public is seeing through the course of these various lawsuits and indictments, these court cases playing out, that the media did in fact lie to them about Donald Trump, and they are still lying about Donald Trump. Donald Trump is not an evil dictator who lies about everything. In fact, he is the target. He is being victimized by a regime that embodies every aspect of all of history's worst regimes and worst evil dictators. And the compounding effect of that over time is extraordinary because everybody understands this is happening. Things have been moving in this direction for a very long time. And the people out there who support Joe Biden's legitimacy have been pushing back on it and trying to stem this tide. But it's not working. No matter how much they try to cover up the fact that it's not working, other people can see. In fact, now everybody can see it. And we're reaching the point where anyone who continues to support the illegitimate Biden regime is looking like they are clueless. They are uncaring. They are making themselves complicit in the corruption and America's decline. Donald Trump doesn't need to spend $1 billion on TV advertising to convince the country of that. As we saw throughout the fake primaries, Ron DeSantis does not have some groundswell of national support. He doesn't have a natural base. And now, whatever base would have come naturally to him, which is that America First MAGA base that he has played to over the last few years, they can't stand Ron. And if you don't have the power as a politician to get people behind you, especially the ones who would be your natural allies, then the likelihood that the donor class is going to be routed through you or convinced by you to support someone else is very, very low. What sort of leverage could Ron DeSantis possibly have right now? Similarly, our elections are rigged and stolen. We don't even know if we will actually have one this year. But if we have one and it's legitimate, then we don't need the DeSantis supporters, at least not enough to compromise with them. Donald Trump will win overwhelmingly. We don't need to begin sacrificing our values for people who directed a hate movement against us for 15 months. And if the election is not legitimate, we also don't need their votes, because the outcomes of the elections are going to be determined by the people who always determine elections, aka not voters. So Trump doesn't need any money that might flow through Ron, and he doesn't need any votes that might flow through Ron. People on the Uniparty right who still pretend that they've been correct about all of it, most especially the 2020 election, are not just simply going to turn off their Trump hate because Ron DeSantis decides that now he likes Trump. When Ron dropped out of the fake primary a few months ago and gave Donald Trump one of the most tepid and passive-aggressive endorsements you could ever hear, he didn't convert his followers, all 12 of those traitors and retards. They simply switched over to supporting Israel and Ukraine as hard as possible, and they figured out new ways to express that they're all very smart and we're all very stupid. The meeting, or so we are told, was set up by a Florida real estate broker named Steve Witkoff, who is said to be friends with both men. Fox News adds at the end, while many on Trump's team and his wider political orbit detest DeSantis, the former president may be more forgiving if it benefits him. Now, is that Fox executing a kayfabe operation, continuing to present Donald Trump in the traditional mainstream media presentation of how Trump is, always after his own good, an egomaniac, a narcissist, not that bright, always transactional about everything, totally unprincipled? Or is this just Fox News supporting the interests of Con Inc., presenting this as Trump pursuing Ron DeSantis' support as something he needs, a situation where Ron has leverage because Ron still somehow in people's minds is the heir apparent for 28. Ron is going to be the presidential candidate. And hey, if Donald Trump redeems Ron DeSantis and Ron DeSantis is the 2028 presidential candidate, and it turns out that all of this was kayfabe and Ron really is a committed supporter of America First, well, I'll be happy to support him in that scenario. If it's all kayfabe and it's all fake, all good. I've talked about that throughout the entire time I was analyzing the Ron DeSantis op. But we can't just assume that, and we have to consider how far we are justified in extending that interpretation. Does it extend to Fox News? Does it extend to the Ron DeSantis simps? Does it extend to the people who went along with everything the Ron DeSantis simps were saying and continue to say? Because they are all still adamantly and aggressively anti-Trump and, more importantly, anti-MAGA supporter. They are all, by the way, major supporters of Israel, and they are all people who attempted to blame Donald Trump for the problems with the COVID vaccines. Being anti-Trump protects the global regime. Blaming Donald Trump for the COVID vaccine rather than the pharma companies who represent a major part of the global regime's agenda pretty directly supports that global regime. And we are talking about people who predominantly took the vaccine and promoted the vaccine. And either way, they went all in on the COVID narrative, the reality of the very deadly pandemic, and still talk about the data, despite the fact that the data is obviously a mess. So is it all kayfabe down to that level? Well, that's doubtful. After this news came out in the afternoon yesterday, people immediately started talking about whether Ron DeSantis would be selected as Donald Trump's vice president. I don't know how. That is the first thing that people think. We are told this is the first time that Trump and DeSantis have even talked in a very long time. As far as I'm concerned, it is a remnant of our time in the normie sphere to even be concerned with who Trump picks as vice president. Why does that matter? Is he going to win people's votes based on who he selects as vice president? No, there's almost no chance that that is going to improve his situation in a rigged election, and in a legitimate election, it won't matter because the people are already on his side and no one is going to go out and support Joe Biden. It's April 29th today. Does anyone actually think Joe Biden is going to have 43% support in 6 months? Of course not. It is only going to get worse for Joe Biden. Trump should, and I believe will, pick the person who is the most authentically America First and who is in the best position to make that case to the American people for whatever comes after Donald Trump's next go-round as president. And you have to at least consider the possibility that our form of government could change. I also think, and have discussed on this podcast before, there is a possibility that we may go back to the original way the vice president was determined, and that's by naming as vice president whoever gets the second most votes in the Electoral College. So we would no longer have a president and his vice presidential running mate. We would just have the individuals running for president, and the two candidates with the most electors would be president and vice president. I think we may even see that scenario this year, and I still think that there is a possibility that could be RFK Jr. Donald Trump has focused some attention on RFK Jr. recently, and this could be kayfabe as well. I'm not saying it is, because much of what Trump says is true. RFK Jr. is a liberal. We talked a couple weeks ago about how RFK Jr. had chosen a vice presidential running mate, and it was just some lady who used to be married to Sergey Brin. RFK Jr. is running a campaign to cater to liberals on liberal issues that he has supported for a long time. Now, I've suggested before that RFK Jr. is kind of the Uniparty left's Donald Trump of 2015 and 2016. The idea being that he exists to attract the members of the Uniparty left who want to be and believe they are acting in good faith with what they support politically, and pulling them away from the Democrat Party establishment and pulling them away from the Uniparty, getting them to understand that it is not just the two-party system that's the problem. It's the fact that those two parties are part of the same thing and work in this controlled opposition dynamic to support an agenda that has absolutely nothing to do with the good of the American people. So Trump made his statements on RFK Jr. on Friday in 3 straight Truth Social posts. And here's what he said. RFK Jr. is a Democrat plant, a radical left liberal who's been put in place in order to help crooked Joe Biden, the worst president in the history of the United States, get reelected. A vote for Jr. would essentially be a wasted protest vote that could swing either way, but would only swing against the Democrats if Republicans knew the true story about him. Jr. is totally anti-gun, an extreme environmentalist who makes the green new scammers look conservative, a big-time taxer and open border advocate, and anti-military and veteran. His radicalized family will never allow him to become a Republican, and his chief funder is the VP candidate that nobody ever heard of, except her ex-husband, who's been stripped of a big chunk of cash. She puts herself down as a businesswoman, or maybe a doctor, and actually, I guess you could say that she's right. Her business was doing surgery on her husband's wallet. She's more liberal than Jr. by far, not a serious person, and only a pot of cash to help get her no-chance candidate on the ballot. I lived with RFK Jr. in New York and watched him convince Governor Cuomo to make environmental moves that were outright nasty. Upstate New York was not allowed to drill or frack, as Ohio, Pennsylvania, and others ripped off New York energy. Because of this, prices have skyrocketed all over that part of the country, but especially upstate New York and New England. Their energy costs are the highest in the U.S., with the exception of California, run by Gavin Newsom, the worst governor in the state's history. I'd even take Biden over Jr. because our country would last a year or two longer prior to collapse, but it would be dead either way. His views on vaccines are fake, as is everything else about his candidacy. Let the Democrats have RFK Jr. They deserve him. Now, this series of posts is going to trigger a lot of people. The Ron supporters lose their mind on this stuff because, again, they're committed to the view that Donald Trump should be to blame for all the problems with the COVID vaccine that they went out and took by choice so that they could represent themselves as trusting the science. These people legitimately took that vaccine in order to own the MAGAs. Then you've got the traditional Democrats who understand now that Joe Biden is way too far left. People who have believed themselves to be centrists, who don't see Joe Biden as a centrist. They thought they could go to RFK Jr. In their minds, RFK Jr. is a centrist. He says some things occasionally about the deep state. He's anti-vax. For those two reasons, they associated him with Trump and MAGA. And because he has a couple issues that disagree with mainstream Democrat ideology, he seemed like a centrist. Now, I've said many times on this podcast, the idea of political centrism doesn't even make sense. There are no political centrists in America. Those are just normies who support the Uniparty and don't want to fully identify with the entirety of their chosen political party's agendas. They're the sorts of people who say that they're socially liberal but fiscally conservative, or that they agree with many of Trump's priorities but certainly don't respect him as a man and understand that he is way too divisive. Their most important political priority is to gain as many reputational points as possible for the political priorities they express, while never finding themselves in a position where their reputations might be negatively affected. They've basically just selected a set of mainstream political slogans that they are happy to repeat, and they've chosen a few from one side of the controlled opposition dynamic and a few from another. And if anyone ever argues, they just say, well, we probably agree about a lot of things. I'm a centrist. Now, imagine if you were one of these people and got on board with RFK Jr., and then the loudest voice in any room that has probably ever existed, Donald Trump, goes out and spreads the idea that RFK Jr. is actually a more extreme leftist than Joe Biden is. Where does that leave people? Well, it forces them to argue that actually, no, RFK Jr. is not that much of a leftist. And think about how that argument would go. It can't be a good one for them to be in. How would they approach that? Arguing that RFK Jr. actually isn't as leftist as Donald Trump says he is puts them in the position of automatically understanding that left-wing priorities are bad ones, as represented by Joe Biden. To defend RFK Jr. from that claim, they already have to assume and embody the notion that being a Democrat is bad. And most of these people would never want to be Republican. So how do they work themselves out of that? It's going to be really hard. And what do you do if you are a person who hates Donald Trump and hates RFK Jr. because he's anti-vax or for any of these other reasons? He's a conspiracy theorist. Even his own family doesn't support him. That's one of their major arguments against him online. And his family legitimately did come out at a Joe Biden event 10 days ago or so. They all endorsed Biden, and they were on stage with him during his speech. And that is when Joe Biden said that he wants to choose freedom over democracy, which is wonderful, but certainly does not make sense from a Democrat perspective or a Joe Biden perspective. And it doesn't fall in line with what we've been pitched by the media over these last few years. Nothing is more important than our democracy, especially not freedom. Are they going to accept Trump's branding that RFK Jr. is more committed to the progressive agenda than they are? There is something here to trigger every anti-Trump demographic. That is why this statement is hilarious and wonderful. You might even call it classic Trump. He even discredits Nicole Shanahan because she is, as we discussed a few weeks ago, a woman who hasn't accomplished a whole hell of a lot aside from marrying a very wealthy guy and being a very committed leftist. Trump even figured out a way to upset the feminists a little more than they were already upset. And I mean, honestly, feminists are upset about everything all the time. That's how they got that way. It is, though, worth noting that Trump points out Nicole Shanahan was the beneficiary of drainage from Sergey Brin. And I should add, in terms of the Ron supporters who are considering backing RFK Jr., the Republican and Republican-friendly, the people who hint at populism and nationalism, the people who understand that the wokeness is a bad idea, a lot of those people who would and should be Trump supporters are still afraid to publicly be Trump supporters because they know they have to deal with the social consequences. And these people are, by and large, still competing for special little prizes within the party of false decorum. They don't want to go that route. RFK Jr. was their out. They could seem like serious people, knowing that they weren't going to go out and support Joe Biden, but they also didn't have to make their liberal friends too angry by going in supporting Donald Trump. Well, now Donald Trump has told people who throw in with quote unquote conservatives, the Ron supporters and everyone else, if you go support that guy, you are supporting an extreme leftist. You have said you are opposed to leftism, and here you are supporting this leftist candidate and saying, no, it's not really that way just because of his view on vaccines. Now, RFK Jr. may well be an anti-vaccine advocate, but he usually doesn't go that far. He usually leaves open the possibility that some vaccines are good. As far as I know, he's never questioned the legitimacy of a viral pandemic. And I may be wrong, but I've never heard him suggest there is any question about Joe Biden's legitimacy. Now, a lot can change in 6 months, but Donald Trump has presented a case. And in this statement, he has targeted 4 or 5 groups who divide along ideological lines and has pretty much made their position untenable among their own peers. This is extremely effective communication. This is the sort of thing the mainstream media used to be able to do well when people trusted them. Now nobody trusts them. Now consider this. As I said, we have 6 months before we are supposed to vote in this very, very real 2024 election. A lot can happen in 6 months. We're going to find out a lot of new things about a lot of new people. The world is going to change in who knows how many ways. And if it's possible that aspects of our current system are challenged constitutionally, and it's determined that our current system is unconstitutional, and of course it is, and we end up using the old way of selecting a vice president, and RFK Jr. is that guy, well, what happens? Donald Trump and RFK Jr. working together? The entire nation by that time knows that the Joe Biden brand of leftism, the Obama brand, is totally untenable. They understand by then that there actually is a uniparty, the uniparty left, the uniparty right. They want to reject both parts of that in full. And while Trump supporters would initially reject RFK Jr. because of legitimate disagreements on very important policies, I understand. There could be an interesting dynamic there nonetheless, but RFK Jr. supporters might quickly realize what the America First movement is all about, and that could be one of the most unifying things in any of our lifetimes. We don't actually have to compromise on any of our principles, because as I often say, we are already a vast majority. If we are able to get to 70 or 80% of the population broken out from that uniparty system, the controlled opposition dynamic between uniparty left and uniparty right, thinking about things as Democrat and Republican, red versus blue, makes no sense. If we're able to break people out of that from the other side, we don't have to agree with those people right away. We don't have to agree with them ever. But imagine how much more productive we would be in solving problems if we were working with people we don't agree with, but understand are operating in good faith and trying to find solutions to what they believe to be real, important problems, rather than simply representing one side or another of that controlled opposition dynamic. We are in an entirely different political reality at that point, and potentially one that we should welcome. Now, I'm not saying that we should pursue this. I'm not saying that we should go out there and support RFK Jr. I don't care about RFK Jr., except to the extent that he might realistically be willing and able to pursue and prosecute the crimes of the deep state and bring a substantial political contingent to the table who opposes the vaccine and pharma regime. Now, if that happens, Trump already knows it will happen, in which case all of this would be kayfabe. and RFK Jr.'s campaign would all be run in support of the pursuit of this particular political goal. He would then be engaged in a psyop to break the psyop that has been conditioning us and corralling us into certain behaviors and ideologies throughout our entire lives. And then, of course, once again, the moral conversation begins. So we talked earlier about Donald Trump's indictments and the court cases to follow, constituting his campaign. I've also made the point on Badlands that the reverse is true as well. The Trump indictments are Joe Biden's campaign. Joe Biden's not going to go out there and hold rallies and fire people up and inspire them. Joe Biden's incapable of all of that. But these lawsuits are specifically designed to repeat all of the slogans and cement all of the ideas that have been spread and seeded throughout the last 9 years. The mainstream media spent last week repeating every element of the Stormy Daniels story, repeating the Billy Bush Access Hollywood tape. We're going to see all of the anti-Trump stories broadcast to the American public once again. I've compared it to the final episode of the TV show Seinfeld. If you didn't see Seinfeld or you didn't watch the final episode, that last episode was basically a trial. All four of the main characters, Jerry, George, Elaine, Kramer, were on trial for basically all the wrongs they had ever done to anyone. And all of these past characters who had appeared throughout the run of the series came on to that final episode to state their case against these four figures. It was just witness after witness coming up and talking about how awful the four of them were. That is basically what we are seeing with these Trump trials. Now, Larry David and Jerry Seinfeld, of course, but Larry David primarily wrote the entire sitcom Seinfeld. And Larry David is one of the biggest Trump haters you can ever imagine, or at least that's his public persona. Seems authentic, but hey, you never know. But in terms of what campaign the fake President Joe Biden might be able to run, there's probably not any better options than rehashing all of those old stories and hoping that they still have their effect with the American public. It is going to be a failure, obviously, but even talented people could not make Joe Biden look good, and Joe Biden is not surrounded by any talent. So the court cases are Trump's campaign, but they're also Biden's campaign. In addition to all that, though, they are a platform for Donald Trump to present the evidence that there was not a very violent insurrection, certainly not one carried out at Trump's direction by MAGA supporters in order to overthrow the government. Didn't happen. It's also going to be an opportunity for him to present evidence that, yeah, the election was stolen. He was not making false claims. He especially was not making knowingly false claims. And as those cases play out, the country is going to come to understand what has been done. Now, I thought that Donald Trump was as indicted as anyone could ever be. He was so indicted, extremely indicted. 91 counts. Well, it's 88 now, but still so many. Could go to jail for 700 years. It's not possible for anyone to be more indicted than Donald Trump is. He is the most indicted man ever. But it turns out he could be more indicted. And so let's get into that. This is from Axios yesterday. Trump allies face criminal trials in majority of key 2024 swing states. So Donald Trump is being put on trial in all the battleground states. And of course, these are the places where Donald Trump committed the most crimes. Look past former President Trump's promising day at the Supreme Court, and you'll see the groundwork to deterring pro-Trump election plots in 2024. Trump's delay strategy appears to be working for him, but many of his loyalists are facing stiff consequences from civil and criminal cases. And yes, it's all real. And the crimes underlying all these cases, they're very real too. Even a dragged-out process on presidential immunity after Thursday's Supreme Court hearing, which has frozen his federal January 6 case, could avoid a verdict before the election. But for Trump's allies in the alleged schemes to overturn the 2020 presidential election results, there's no such luck. Pro-Trump lawyers have faced sanctions and censure, and Rudy Giuliani risks being disbarred in the backlash to the efforts. In a civil settlement in Wisconsin, former Trump lawyers Kenneth Chesbrough and Jim Troupis agreed to never participate in future schemes. Oh, wow. They have given up their lives of scheming. At least 4 of the 7 swing states expected to decide the 2024 presidential election have active criminal cases against pro-Trump fake electors. Arizona, a group of 11 pro-Trump electors, was indicted Wednesday. 7 other people were unnamed defendants. We'll get to that in just a second. Georgia, Trump is the star defendant in the Fulton County indictment of 15 people in August 2023. The trial is scheduled to begin in August, and this is that Fani Willis trial that's going so well for her. Michigan. During pretrial hearings on Wednesday, Trump was identified as an unindicted co-conspirator in the sweeping state case against 16 fake electors charged in July 2023. Nevada. 6 people were indicted in December, including the Nevada GOP chair, for being fake electors. A trial won't begin before 2025. Wisconsin. Wisconsin Attorney General Josh Kaul won't say whether his office is investigating the 10 pro-Trump fake electors from 2020. Now, they keep calling them fake electors. They're not fake electors. They're just alternate electors. It's not a crime. It's never been a crime. It's not the first time it happened. And there is at least some chance that they're just the real electors from 2020 and that history will record them as such. I think it would be absolutely crazy to dismiss that possibility because the election was stolen and pretty much everybody involved knows it. Therefore, these people's action in pursuit of the legitimate result cannot possibly be criminal, and history will not record it that way. Axios says the bottom line is this: I don't think a lot of people will want to sign up for that again. Michael Teeter, the managing director of the 65 Project, which pursues legal discipline against lawyers involved in the fake electors' efforts, told the Associated Press. So this guy has an organization that wages lawfare efforts against Americans who signed up to be electors for Donald Trump in 2020 and presented themselves as the legitimate electors that year. The man who is pursuing them and trying to have them prosecuted and ruining their lives claims that the upshot of all this is that they won't try it again. He is asserting the belief that anyone who might consider being an alternate elector for Donald Trump in the event that elections in various states are stolen again will not do it because they understand that in the future they might be prosecuted. He is apparently very proud of that sort of thing. So let's talk a bit about the situation in Arizona. This is from Thursday last week, the 25th. ABC News, Giuliani, Meadows, indicted in Arizona fake elector scheme. Trump, unindicted co-conspirator. Several former and current aides to former President Donald Trump appear to be among those charged by the Arizona State Attorney General over their alleged efforts to overturn the 2020 election. They include Rudy Giuliani, Mark Meadows, and former Trump attorney John Eastman, as well as Boris Epshteyn, who remains one of Trump's closest advisors and a current member of his 2024 campaign team. Arizona Attorney General Chris Mays also announced charges against 11 named alleged fake electors and 7 people whose names are redacted in the filing for their alleged roles in efforts to subvert Joe Biden's 2020 victory in the state. The charges include fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Unindicted co-conspirator 1 in the indictment appears to be Trump, as the language of the document says they were involved in a scheme to keep him and former Vice President Mike Pence in office against the will of Arizona's voters. based on a review of the descriptions of the 7 redacted names in the Arizona indictment, the additional co-defendants are Rudy Giuliani, Mark Meadows, Boris Epstein, John Eastman, Christina Bobb, Jenna Ellis, and Mike Roman. Now, I read through this entire indictment on Friday night. Yes, I have an extraordinarily exciting social life. I read through the 58-page indictment on Friday evening. It was not very compelling at all. It was essentially just a review of the communications that Chris Mays, the illegitimate Attorney General of Arizona, was able to procure. She presented all of their communications as though they were scheming and conducting this conspiracy to overthrow the legitimate results of the election. That was their intent the whole time. They knew that Trump lost because the evidence, by the way, is the same in the other Trump cases. The evidence that Trump knew he lost was that other people around Trump said that Trump lost. That is not evidence of anything. Of course, it's the same idea that we were discussing earlier with Bill Barr. That is one of the justifications for people who try to pretend that Joe Biden really received 81 million real lawful American votes and that Trump knew it. Their proof is that other people told him. There's no proof that those people were right or had special access to information that would have left them well informed about the truth or falsity of the claims. It's just that they made those claims and Trump would have heard them make those claims. Therefore, Trump knew that he was lying. It's preposterous, but how else are they possibly going to approach that? It's not like they have an abundant supply of true things that they can say about any of this. They are prosecuting all of these cases on totally made up crimes supported by no evidence, all of them with blatant and preposterous falsehoods making up the entire foundation of the case. If Joe Biden didn't receive 81 million real lawful American votes, and if there was fraud and interference in these states, and of course Donald Trump knows there was, then all of the rest of the claims in these indictments immediately fall apart. In every situation, the only facts that matter at the very bottom are all on Trump's side. The indictment is not even serious. I encourage you to read it and see for yourself. Now, I mentioned that Arizona Attorney General Chris Mays was illegitimate. That's because she is. As in 2020, Arizona's 2022 midterm election that we were told produced Governor Katie Hobbs and Attorney General Chris Mays was a complete and total uncertifiable mess and therefore should not have been certified. The certification of that election is itself a crime. And unless all of that is also kayfabe, these people should spend the rest of their lives in prison at minimum. Mays' opponent, Abe Hamadeh, has been challenging her illegitimate win for a year and a half now. Mays was said to have won by 280 votes in Arizona, a state that took weeks to finish counting the votes in 2022. Hamadeh went on War Room on Friday to discuss.
Abe, this fake attorney general, the phony attorney general in Arizona, that is still only up on you by 208 votes. And I think it's 9,000 votes they refused to count. Is it 9,000 or is it more? They refused to count.
That's right, Steve. It's 9,000. 9,000 uncounted ballots. And, just last week we had the Court of Appeals deny us a new trial, but we actually had one brave judge who said that we should get a new trial because the government withheld the evidence. So we are still fighting that lawsuit. We're going to be filing to the Supreme Court very shortly. But we've seen what a weaponized legal system does, and it's tragic. It's a tragedy to the law.
This is part of the criminal. Is there any doubt in your mind, as someone that is actually the legitimate attorney general of the state of Arizona and now is running for the House, is there any doubt in your mind that this is part of a broader criminal conspiracy to basically have election interference against MAGA candidates and MAGA people that support MAGA?
Yeah, you'd have to be living under a rock to not know what's going on. I mean, this is clearly a fake, illegitimate attorney general. I mean, look at how brazen they are, Steve. You got to respect it in some ways. She's not even legitimate, and yet she is going after these alternate electors, and now not just them, but going after Trump's team. I mean, it's very brazen what's happening. 9-count indictment. These are high-level felonies, Steve, in Arizona, and almost all of these felonies, I read through the indictments. I mean, these are such broad statutes. You know, if somebody wanted to weaponize the legal system, this is exactly what you would do. And the timing, all of this is predictable. It's during an election year, right when President Trump's in trial in New York, and this is Chris Mays trying to get her fame right now, like Fonnie Willis, like Alvin Bragg, like Jack Smith, like Letitia James. So this is a perversion of the rule of law, Steve.
And obviously he's right. She's illegitimate. This is being done for political reasons. There's no legitimate way for them to go after Trump. There's no possible chance that Joe Biden would beat him in any legitimate election. And it's getting to the point where it would be impossible to convince the country that Joe Biden even could win a legitimate election. And that's the whole point. In 2020, people were prepared to believe that Biden could win. It doesn't matter if they really believe that he did win. They didn't want to fight over that. It was enough that everyone understood. Everybody else thought there was at least a chance Joe Biden could win. So when Biden is announced the winner, people are like, okay, well, I guess that's possible. And that was enough. If this year Joe Biden is announced to have gotten 95 million votes and Donald Trump 75 million votes, there is absolutely no way the American people, by and large, would believe that. No one could believe that Joe Biden, after the last 4 years, not only received 20 million more votes than Donald Trump, but received 14 million more votes than his impossibly high total from 2020. No one would believe that. Therefore, they can't do that. They can't pull it off. But they also couldn't pull off what they pulled off in 2020. They're not going to be able to tell the American public that Joe Biden won 81 million votes to Donald Trump's 74 or 75 million. The country would not believe that right now. The polling doesn't suggest it's possible. And everyone understands that no matter how many Biden voters and anti-Trump voters there were in 2020, there are fewer of both right now. They know Democrats are losing black voters, Hispanic voters, young voters, working class voters, union voters, all of it. Every demographic that represents the Democrat base, except college-educated white women, hey, feminists, has fled Joe Biden and the Democrat Party in droves and have gone toward Donald Trump. Some of them went toward RFK for now. But the point is they can't possibly convince anyone. So they need to either pursue a different strategy or change the game enough so that people would believe there's a chance Joe Biden could be reelected over Donald Trump. And this is their campaign to do that. This is the strategy. Beyond this, all they have is creating disasters in the real world and hoping to get everybody back on the same page and believing all of the same things so that they can then reroute that to Biden support. Here is Arizona's illegitimate Attorney General Chris Mays on MSNBC describing the strategy.
Well, as my colleague from Massachusetts just mentioned, we absolutely have to get President Biden reelected, because one of my fears is, despite the fact that Republicans said they wanted to send this back to states for states to decide, I think there's a real movement in the sort of extreme elements.
Now, she's referring to that state law on the books in Arizona regarding abortion. And she is a Democrat, so of course she has political leanings, but she's not shy about the fact that she wants to elect Joe Biden. She is prosecuting the alternate elector slate and the associates of Joe Biden's political opponent. Now, Donald Trump is an unindicted co-conspirator in that case. It's possible that Chris Mays will eventually indict Donald Trump. And to be honest, I hope she does. Donald Trump is already so indicted, but he could be more indicted, apparently. And if he was more indicted, then they would have to go through Arizona's election fraud claims. And what could be better than that? Let's get a Donald Trump election fraud related case in all of these states and have them all play out before the American public, so the American public can see all of the evidence of election fraud in all of these various states. I hope we'll get to see it in the months leading right up to the very real election we are certainly going to have on November 5th. Now, the king of election theft related lawfare himself, Mark Elias, published this article 1 week ago, Monday, the 22nd, on his website, Democracy Docket. Republicans are suing for the right to harass election workers. You might think that even in today's highly polarized election environment, there would be a bipartisan consensus to protect election workers from intimidation and harassment. If you thought so, you would be wrong. In recent weeks, there have been a series of lawsuits aimed at undoing protections for election workers. Nevada recently enacted a new election worker protection law to combat the increasing threats faced by election workers. The law, which passed the legislature unanimously and was signed by the Republican governor, makes it a crime to, quote, use or threaten to attempt to use any force, intimidation, coercion, violence, restraint, or undue influence with the intent to interfere with the performance of the duties of any election official relating to an election, or retaliate against any election officials for performing duties relating to an election. Shortly after the law was enacted, the Republican Party's failed 2022 Attorney General candidate, who is currently a Republican National Committee woman, filed a lawsuit to block the law. Her argument is that it violates her First Amendment rights and is too vague to understand. Meanwhile, in Arizona, right-wing organizations, including America First Policy Institute, founded by former Trump aides, are suing to block the anti-harassment provisions of the state's election procedures manual from going into effect. Among the provisions they find objectionable are those that prohibit any activity by a person with the intent or effect of threatening, harassing, intimidating, or coercing voters or conspiring with others to do so. Aggressive behavior such as raising one's voice or taunting a voter or poll worker, using threatening, insulting, or offensive language to a voter or poll worker, following voters or poll workers coming to or leaving a voting location, including to or from their vehicles, questioning, photographing, or videotaping voters or poll workers in a harassing or intimidating manner, including when the voter or poll worker is entering or leaving the polling location. Elias has a short discussion of some things that are happening in Minnesota and the results of some prior lawsuits, and then writes, I have previously warned that right-wing vigilantism is the greatest threat to free and fair elections this November. This includes mass voter challenges, disinformation campaigns aimed at misleading voters, and sadly, targeting election officials and voters for intimidation and harassment. And of course, in the way they define these things, it basically counts as virtually any pushback or resistance to anything these election workers do. They want to eliminate the possibility for us to see all that video evidence we saw in the election process itself, and then, of course, in the aftermath in 2020 and beyond. They want to make it impossible for people with their phones to videotape election workers violating the law. That would be the sort of thing they're claiming constitutes harassment. You want to film those election workers covering windows with pizza boxes? Well, now you're harassing the election workers and you're committing a crime. You want to record election workers throwing out ballots, as we saw in 2020? Well, that's a crime. You want to record election workers altering ballots by hand? Crime. You want to record election workers bringing ballots into counting centers in the middle of the night? Well, that's a crime. They don't want any record of what they're doing because that is going to sow doubt in our democracy. That's what tears down our democracy. Stolen elections? No problem. Individual citizens using their phones in public places to record public officials committing crimes, that's the real crime. Elias goes on. Republicans know that this November they will lose the popular vote for president by millions of votes. Their only strategy to overcome this deficit is to make it harder to vote and easier to cheat. That is why former President Donald Trump's senior advisor, who now effectively runs the RNC, Chris LaCivita, recently insisted that, quote, the RNC's new posture as it relates to litigation is much more offensive and much less defensive. In no way does that constitute an attempt to make it harder to vote and easier to cheat. Elias writes, suing to add obstacles to vote and to purge voters is the kind of Republicans playing offense that all too many people now accept as normal. Suing to empower vigilantes to harass voters and election officials is just the next logical step for a desperate campaign without any moral compass. These people are insane. Demanding voter ID, for instance, or demanding that signature matching laws are followed, for instance, or that mail-in and absentee voting should be eliminated, for instance. All of these things, to Mark Elias, are things that make it harder to vote. But they're actually just things that increase election integrity. And without those things, election integrity, as we have seen, is impossible. And as far as purging voters go, the voter rolls should be purged in their entirety and be rebuilt from nothing. If we had a serious country right now, that is what we would be doing. But of course, we don't have a serious country. We have people like Mark Elias suggesting that despite the fact that the voter rolls contain around the country millions and millions of ineligible voters, dead voters, illegal alien voters, etc., a purge is voter suppression. That is the sort of thing that threatens, quote unquote, our democracy. But he mentions America First Legal. So let's go to this from the Daily Caller. This is from last Friday, the 26th. America First Policy Institute demands key battleground states enforce ban on non-citizen voting. You see that? They're trying to make it harder to vote for illegal aliens. The America First Policy Institute is demanding that key battleground states enforce their constitutional duty to ensure that non-Americans do not vote in the upcoming 2024 election, the Daily Caller learned. AFPI addressed 9 letters to the chief elections officers of Virginia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, New York, Nevada, Michigan, Illinois, California, and Arizona, where the organization says there are the most amount of illegal aliens. The letters obtained by the Daily Caller demand that each state under the National Voter Registration Act ensure that only eligible citizens are registered to vote. This issue should be straightforward. The federal government should be doing everything in its power to ensure that only U.S. citizens vote in federal elections. This is their constitutional duty. Yet actions of the Biden administration paint a different story. Chad Wolf, former acting Homeland Security Secretary and executive director of the America First Policy Institute, said in a press release obtained by the Daily Caller, the American people deserve to know that states will take all the necessary steps to ensure only American citizens exercise our sacred right to vote. The letters call on each state's leader of elections, whether the Secretary of State or Executive Director, to oversee how the state complies with the National Voter Registration Act. Due to the failure of the Biden administration to secure the border, it is now incumbent on officials like you to ensure that the 2024 election is not compromised by illegal aliens casting votes. Since 2021, no less than 11 million illegal aliens have entered the country. This is a population greater than that of 11 states and the District of Columbia combined, which together account for 41 electoral votes in a presidential election. The letter sent to Arizona's Secretary of State, Adrian Fontes, reads, and of course, Adrian Fontes is as corrupt and illegitimate as Katie Hobbs and Chris Mays. He was a major player in the stolen election in Arizona in 2020. So they've targeted 9 states specifically. Does anyone think that they don't have evidence of illegal aliens voting in our elections in order to bring this case? Now, to be fair, it seems like they are just asking these states specifically to follow their own laws and make sure that they are doing so in good faith and doing so effectively, making sure that whatever illegal aliens appear on their voter rolls are removed. But this is a pretty substantial shot across the bow. States do not generally follow these laws. They don't care about purging their voter rolls of illegal aliens. Using the identities of illegal aliens to fill the voter rolls so that they can then determine the outcome of elections is part of the Uniparty's election theft strategy. And of course, for pursuing this thing that is lawful and necessary, the Trump side will be accused of attempting to suppress the votes of Black and brown Americans, because that is how absurd all of this has become by this point. Now, whether all of this that we can see playing out is completely real or completely fake, the effect is the same. If we are seeing a stage show, that stage show is having the same effect as it would have if it was all real. The indictments are absurd. The underlying claims on which all of these cases are based are completely and totally false. There is no evidence anywhere Joe Biden received anywhere near 81 million real lawful American votes, and no one can produce evidence to substantiate that because the evidence does not exist. So if these officials were all legitimate and these were all real legitimate indictments, the cases would still be fake cases because they're based on factual claims that cannot be substantiated in reality. Even if they're able to work their way toward a jury convicting Donald Trump or any Trump associates of any of these crimes, none of it will matter in the end because it will be appealed and overturned. There are no facts beneath this. And regardless of any of that, all that matters is the court of public opinion, which means that once again, we are back to a battle of narratives. And in that case, the Kayfabe strategy is every bit as good and real and valid as the legal strategies being pursued by these illegitimate officials. And so let's close with Donald Trump outside of the Alvin Bragg hush money Stormy Daniels case last week, calling all of this exactly what it is, election interference, while knowing that it's also his campaign.
Which election interference, this is the way they think they're going to get elected. But I guess based on what I'm looking at, it's driving up my poll numbers, not driving them down.
All these cases sure are working pretty well for him. His poll numbers are going up. Joe Biden's poll numbers are going down. The entire thing is being exposed in front of the American people. And by the end of this, he might get to present election fraud evidence in every one of the battleground states for the American public to see in a way that is fully convincing without him ever having to be the one bringing it forward. And maybe all this is happening naturally, and it's all just a fortunate coincidence that their best strategy is also our best strategy. Or maybe Donald Trump is manipulating the public narrative better than anyone ever could. Classic Trump. I'll be back tomorrow at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic. Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening to this episode for free, you can support me and support the show and the work I do by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can do so for as low as $50 a year or $5 a month. Comes out to under $0.25 per episode, and you'll blast right through the paywall for all of the writing. The merch store is www.cancelcouture.com, and you can find everything else by heading to Linktree. Linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. And I'll see you soon out on the range. It's happening!